The stack of printed pages sat on the corner of the office desk, neatly aligned, almost ordinary if you didn't know its significance. To anyone walking by, it was just paper, routine memos, maybe reports, but investigators saw it differently. They saw the trace of a plan that had been interrupted, a small slip that would unravel months of carefully managed deception. The Mapleton office case began in early 2017 in Mapleton, Colorado, when the IT department noticed irregular access to the company's financial server. Early reports suggested missing spreadsheets, altered records, and sudden deletions that didn't match the standard workflow. The office manager, who had long been trusted by colleagues and upper management, was the last person known to access the affected files before the discrepancies were flagged. He maintained that he had simply completed routine duties and that any missing data had been an oversight by the system. Investigators arrived to assess the digital environment, documenting file servers, audit logs, and user activity. Forensic analysts began reconstructing the timeline, noting which files had been accessed, copied, and deleted. Early examination revealed that the office manager had executed a series of deletions in the hours before the IT alert. But the central question became, what had been altered, and had anything left a trace? That's when the printer logs were discovered. Court filings later show that a 36-page document had been sent to the office printer minutes before the deletion sequence began. The spool record, maintained automatically by the networked printer, indicated the document had printed successfully at 9:47 a.m., even though the office manager later claimed he hadn't printed anything that morning. Analysts noted the file name, the number of pages, and the timestamp, and immediately recognized a conflict with his account. The pivot point was small, but critical. A single 36-page printout, a routine operation in a busy office, contradicted the narrative of routine work. Investigators later explained how printer spool records operate. Each print job is logged automatically with the username, document title, number of pages, and timestamp. Even if a file is deleted from a computer or server, the spool record remains on the printer's internal memory. That memory is generally overlooked, a silent witness most employees never consider. Investigators cross-referenced the print job against server access logs and deletion timestamps. The alignment was clear. The document had been printed, and then, within minutes, the corresponding files were removed from the system. Attempts to reconstruct deleted data showed partial recovery of spreadsheets, formulas, and internal notes. The sequence indicated an awareness that the files were sensitive, and that deletion would obscure the activity. Early interviews with colleagues reinforced the importance of the print log. Many had assumed that any files missing after routine daily work were simple errors. The office manager's reputation allowed these assumptions to persist, but forensic recovery demonstrated patterns inconsistent with typical user behavior. Files were not merely missing, they had been targeted. The print spool confirmed that someone intended to create a tangible record. Court testimony emphasized the sequence. Analysts walked jurors through the 36-page document. They showed that the content matched the deleted files. They explained the mechanics of file deletion. In networked environments, a user may believe data is gone when it is not. Residual fragments exist across servers and workstations. The print logs served as the initial anchor, proof that files had existed. They had been removed in a narrow window corresponding with the office manager's access. From there, investigators expanded their review. Backup tapes, server logs, and residual file fragments were cataloged and time-stamped. Each piece reinforced the same timeline, a printed record followed by rapid deletion. Even attempts to obscure the trail were documented. Analysts concluded that the deletion was deliberate, not accidental. The print job left an unalterable trace. By the time the evidence was compiled for prosecution, the narrative was clear. The office manager executed actions that left one critical oversight, say, the print spool provided the pivot point. That tiny slip guided the investigation through a maze of deleted files. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, procedural, and inevitable. The stack of pages on the desk represented a mistake he hadn't accounted for. Once investigators had it, they could trace every subsequent move, back to that single, ordinary but unchangeable trace. The office manager believed his plan was foolproof. But technology, as always, had remembered. Investigators later described the moment the printer spool record was analyzed as the turning point. Everything else depended on a pivot that confirmed the files had existed at a specific time. That 9:47 a.m. timestamp on the 36-page document became the anchor for the reconstruction. Court filings show forensic analysts spent hours verifying the integrity of the spool logs. They checked for possible overrides or system errors. None were found. The record was precise, automatic, and impartial. The sequence of events became strikingly clear. The office manager accessed the server, selected the sensitive financial files, printed the 36-page report, and then executed deletions across multiple directories. Recovery attempts later revealed fragments of formulas and tables. The full context was confirmed only through the printed document. IT specialists testified that while digital deletions can sometimes appear to erase evidence, peripheral traces often persist. Metadata, backup caches, and print logs often persist, waiting for a meticulous review to uncover them. Early internal reviews had missed the print job entirely. Colleagues had assumed the absence of files was a system error or misfiled data. The office manager's consistent history of reliability lent credibility to that assumption. Yet, once the print spool was cross-referenced with server activity, the narrative began to fracture. Investigators could now show a deliberate window: access, print, deletion. Each step left a timestamp. Each timestamp contradicted the story he had offered during initial questioning. Forensic testimony highlighted the critical role of digital traces in corporate investigations. The logs were not just backups, they were evidence. In court, analysts explained how the networked environment preserves multiple layers of activity. Even if a user believes a file has been erased, residual metadata and system-generated logs record the truth. The printed pages were a physical manifestation of what had already left traces on the server. Investigators also reviewed attempts to obscure activity. Temporary files had been renamed, folders rearranged, and shadow copies altered. But system-level timestamps remained consistent. The printer spool record had no mechanism for retroactive deletion. It was an immutable trace, unalterable and time-stamped. This small oversight became the single point where investigators could confirm the sequence. The prosecution emphasized this pivot in opening arguments. Every subsequent forensic step was contextualized against that timestamp. Analysts demonstrated how each subsequent deletion aligned with the printout. The ordinary appearance of the pages belied their evidentiary weight. They were small, printed sheets that told a story no verbal explanation could rewrite. Investigators had reconstructed the office manager's actions minute by minute. Backup logs and audit records all pointed back to that single pivot, the spool record. A single routine operation, printing a document, left a trace that survived intentional deletion. Colleagues who had once vouched for his diligence faced a quiet, incontrovertible record. The evidence didn't dramatize the act. It didn't assign emotion. It only showed access, print, and deletion. That sequence became the foundation of the case against him. The stack of pages had transformed into the key that unlocked the truth. Investigators reflected that the case's resolution depended on noticing the unassuming printout. A single oversight created a pivot that exposed the discrepancy between his story and the documented record. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was decisive. In 2017, that quiet trace inside the printer memory became the point where a plan thought secure first began to unravel. Once the printer spool record was firmly established as the pivot, investigators widened the lens to trace the broader impact of that small oversight. Every deletion and every attempt to erase or rename files were now examined in the context of the 9:47 a.m. printout. Analysts reconstructed the office network environment. They showed how each server action and every directory modification aligned with the timestamped print. Court filings emphasized that the office manager had left a consistent digital footprint. It was unbroken except by the very files he had tried to erase. Backup tapes and shadow copies revealed partial recoveries that were meaningless until anchored to the print job. Each fragment could now be tied to a tangible, physical document that existed before deletion. The jury saw how even attempts to obscure activity were recorded passively by system logs. The folders accessed, temporary files created and removed, all contributed to this narrative. In forensic terms, the printout became a chronological anchor. It was the first piece of tangible evidence against an otherwise digital trail. IT analysts explained how the networked printer functioned as an independent recorder. Its spool memory maintained job logs regardless of subsequent deletions on connected computers. Court testimony highlighted that these logs were automatically generated and resistant to alteration. That 36-page document was not just paper, it was an immutable trace. It was a record outside the office manager's control. The pivot had occurred quietly in a machine's memory. Investigators then mapped out the deletion timeline minute by minute. Files across multiple servers vanished in rapid succession after the print job, suggesting deliberate coordination. Attempts to restore deleted directories revealed that some content had survived. It was only when cross-referenced with the printout that it made sense. The physical pages provided context to otherwise fragmented digital evidence. Colleagues' initial accounts of missing files as routine errors now appeared incomplete. Their observations were accurate, but the significance of the print log reframed the situation. Early reports indicated only minor discrepancies. But once the print job was discovered, the full extent of deliberate deletions became clear. Forensic testimony emphasized that in networked office systems, digital traces accumulate silently. Even ordinary operations like printing can create immutable evidence when paired with system logs. The prosecution used the printout as a chronological anchor to demonstrate pattern and intent. Each deletion, each attempted obfuscation traced back to that one pivot, the 36-page job at 9:47 a.m. It was a quiet revelation, not an explosion of dramatic events. The physical stack of pages on a desk became symbolic, ordinary, yet carrying the weight of actions that had tried to vanish in digital space. Investigators later reflected on how small oversights often expose much larger schemes. In this case, the office manager had meticulously deleted files, hoping to leave no trace. But the printer had recorded the first move, the action that would unravel the rest. That 36-page record linked digital activity to a physical object, creating a timeline that was undeniable and verifiable. By mid-trial, the jury could follow the sequence: server access, document printing, deletion across multiple directories, attempted recovery, each step anchored to the print job, which became the immutable reference point. The evidence was procedural, calm, and systematic. No dramatic chase, no explosive discovery, just the careful work of investigators connecting what was intended to disappear with the trace it left behind. The office manager's reliance on digital deletion had overlooked the smallest of traces. The print spool, a system he considered mundane and inconsequential, had preserved the first step in the sequence. One page, one timestamp, one machine memory, that was enough to pivot an entire investigation. And as forensic analysts detailed in court, it was often these overlooked routine traces that ultimately reveal intent and action in workplace crime investigations. From there, every additional digital artifact, server logs, residual file fragments, audit trails, could be contextualized. But it all traced back to that single quiet pivot point, the 36-page printout minutes before deletion. The office manager had believed the plan was airtight, but a simple printer log had begun to undo it, layer by layer, timestamp by timestamp, page by page. By the time the trial entered its final phase, the 36-page printout had become more than just evidence. It was the lens through which every action was interpreted. Court filings show that forensic analysts spent hours presenting a minute-by-minute reconstruction. They demonstrated how each deletion, each altered folder, and each residual fragment aligned with the time-stamped print. The office manager's initial statements, once accepted at face value, now conflicted with a concrete, verifiable record. Investigators highlighted how the printout acted as a pivot in both digital and procedural terms. While file recovery can be partial or inconsistent, a physical document is undeniable. Analysts explained that even sophisticated deletion attempts leave digital footprints. But these footprints require context. The print job provided exactly that context, allowing each recovered fragment to be placed precisely within a timeline. This connection between tangible pages and intangible server logs created a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. Throughout court testimony, IT specialists emphasized the predictability and immutability of printer spool logs. Each job, they noted, is automatically timestamped, linked to a username, and recorded in the printer's memory. Unlike file deletion, which can be masked or partially undone, the spool record remains independent. That 9:47 a.m. print job had created a permanent digital trace, one that investigators could not overlook, and that contradicted the office manager's account. Cross-referencing backup tapes, shadow copies, and temporary file histories reinforced the same story. Each deletion now appeared deliberate, following the print job with a precision that suggested forethought. Even minor anomalies, like the sequence of temporary file removals, were given meaning when tied to the printed document. Analysts testified that these patterns reflected intentional effort to remove sensitive material, and that the printout anchored the timeline, providing a reference point that no subsequent deletion could erase. Colleagues' observations were reframed in this context. Early reports suggested simple errors, but the pivot of the print job transformed the investigation. It explained how minor discrepancies fit into a coherent pattern. The stack of pages on the desk represented the first step in a sequence of deletions. In the eyes of investigators, it was the overlooked trace. Legal filings emphasized that the pivot point allowed prosecutors to tie evidence together. The jury saw how the time-stamped print created a chronological anchor. Access, print, deletion, every action could be contextualized and verified. It was methodical, procedural, and based on verifiable facts. By the end of the evidentiary phase, the narrative was clear. The office manager's attempts at digital deletion had been carefully documented, but the single printout provided the unalterable link. Investigators later reflected that without noticing the print job, the timeline could have remained speculative. Even as the jury deliberated, the significance of the printout remained powerful. One small operation, a print job at 9:47 a.m., revealed a discrepancy. That stack of pages contained the first undeniable trace of action, the pivot around which the entire investigation turned. And while subsequent analysis filled in details, every step traced back to that single pivot. It was a reminder that ordinary systems preserve truths. The office manager's confidence had collided with a simple stack of printed pages, and in that collision, the investigation found its first unbreakable thread.